All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Gumtree of Liberty podcast, episode number 23. I'm your host, Stuart. I'm joined today by my co-host, Centrist, and our guest, Kate Fantinel, Lady Liberty.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. So give us a rundown. Who are you? What are you doing? Where are you running? And give us a bit of a history of Kate and how you became the person running for this at the moment.
Well, I'm originally from South Australia. I grew up in a regional area, spent my weekends at the farm, my grandmother's farm, moved to Adelaide at 18, went to university and studied journalism. I moved back to the country where I was from to give back to the community that raised me. But I quickly discovered that journalism isn't the fourth estate that I thought it would be. So it wasn't all lost though, because I did cover the state election and the federal election during my time, and that's what sparked my interest in politics. So I returned to Adelaide and went back to university and studied a graduate diploma of public relations and got involved in government relations side of things. My first job out of that was working for the South Australian Chamber of Minerals and Energy, which is an advocacy group representing mining companies and energy companies in South Australia. I then moved on to work for the Sporting Shooters Association of Australia, which is Australia's largest group of licensed firearm owners. They're on about 208,000 members at the moment, so quite a large group of law-abiding firearm owners. And during my time there, when I was working in media and politics, is when I met former Senator David Leyonhjelm. He is of course, the first Liberal Democrat ever elected. He was elected in 2013 into the Senate. And after meeting him, I started watching his speeches in the Parliament, and everything he was saying was resonating with me. And I'd never seen or met a politician who I could say I agreed with 99% of what they were saying. It's just unheard of. So I was always socially progressive but economically conservative. So I grew up voting for the Liberal Party, but the conservative side really didn't sit well with me because I am socially progressive. And that's when I discovered that I was a libertarian, because I agreed with everything, almost everything David Leyonhjelm was saying. So I pursued him quite hard for a job, and he finally caved in and gave me a job in his electorate office in Sydney. So I worked for him between Sydney and Canberra, travelled there for the sitting weeks, and then he promoted me to be his media advisor. Following his loss at the New South Wales state election, when he tried to switch from the Senate to the state, because the Senate voting quota was changed to dramatically make it harder for minor parties, I then got offered a job in Perth working for Aaron Stonehouse, who was an upper house member for the Liberal Democrats over here in Western Australia. So I moved again for the party, came over here to work part-time for Aaron Stonehouse, and I worked with him until the March 2021 election loss, which I'm still trying to recover from, because we're really suffering here in the West with McGowan and his unchecked power. He holds both the lower and the upper house, and I'm genuinely concerned that we'll have a Labor federal government, and I cannot imagine living in a country with Labor, and Labor. I wake up in cold sweats thinking about it. So that's why I'm running for the Senate in Western Australia for the Liberal Democrat.
So you said that you had to deal with the change of the quota. And I think that's a big thing that Lib Dems are dealing with right now: suppression of minor parties by the majors. Labor, Liberal, Nationals, Greens. I know recently you guys have been in, was it High Court for a challenge to the party name? Can you explain that a bit?
Yes, so we've had challenges over the years in relation to our name from the Liberal Party, but Liberal Democrats is the most accurate reflection of what we believe in, a liberal democracy. The Liberal Party of Australia is not the Menzies Liberal Party of Australia. So really, if the case was judged on who is actually the more liberal party in the true sense of the word, we would have won hands down. But during the peak of the COVID crisis, the Liberal and Labor Party combined to pass legislation to make it harder for parties to keep their name. So any new parties cannot use the name of something that's already in a registered party. Now, this means it's not just the Liberal Democrats who are affected, socialist parties. Now, we all know there's different branches of socialism. So now there can only be one Socialist Party of Australia. So unfortunately, we just lost the case only by one judge. It was only one vote that didn't get us across the line. And we have to change our name, but not until after the election due to the timeline. So we will be the Liberal Democrats for the federal election. After that will be the Liberty and Democracy Party. So it's quite fortunate because I've called myself Lady Liberty. I got a Liberty tattoo this week. And so maybe there was something that I knew deep down that it would happen. But it's really disappointing for democracy because people should be allowed to have their party named after what they believe in. And that is no longer an option for a lot of minor parties.
Am I correct in saying that they raised the threshold by threefold for having the number of signatures needed to be registered as a party?
Yes, that's correct. So this is just another example of the major parties combining to try and squeeze out everything from the minor parties, squeezing us out of existence. Back when I was working for former Senator Leinhelm, they started this process by changing the quota system for the Senate. So it is really difficult for a minor party to get elected. And he spoke about that at the time, but I think this election you'll see just how significant and how little minor parties will be left. I had a look before I came on your show, and in 2013, when Leinhelm was elected, 227 parties contested the Senate across the country. 2016, in the double dissolution, it went to 206. In 2019, it went to just 11 parties had people running in the Senate. So 2022, with all these changes, increased number of members required, the quota, they've also increased the nomination fee from $1,000 to $2,000. So an independent who's running on a shoestring budget. It's really sad for democracy that we're in this state where it's just so hard to be part of the election process. It's expensive and you have to check so many more boxes. It's really sad for democracy that we're at this stage.
Yeah, I remember back in 2016, double dissolution election, which is always better for minor parties, instead of showing my age or lack thereof. I remember going to the polling booth with Dad and seeing like a meter-long piece of paper for the Senate ballot, which is crazy. Even as you said, down to 11 last time, and it'll probably be even less this time because of the treatment that we're seeing minor parties being given. Lib Dems, UAP, a whole heap of minors, even Family First. I'm surprised that they're letting the Family First run into the street because that's a former party that was around in the 2000s and before then. Do you think it's going to be any problem having democracy in your name now when you have the DLP, Democratic Labour Party? Will there be a challenge around that, do you expect?
I hope not. I know they've been affected by it too because of the word Labor, of course. So for us, we're still a registered party. We've got a plan to be registered as Liberty and Democracy after the election. But the Democratic Labour Party, they can challenge our name. That's the law now. So if any party tries to register with a word that is similar in an already registered name, we can take it to the High Court, which is what we've had happen to us. And luckily, the timeline is in our favour, so we get to keep our name one last time. And I must stress, this is only at a federal level. So the Liberal Democrats can continue to exist as the Liberal Democrats in each of the states. But there's obviously a discussion about the Liberal word is so tarnished now by the Liberal Party. They're not Liberal anymore. So do we actually want to have that word that they've trashed in our party name? It's an interesting discussion that's going to be had in each of the state branches of the party.
Is there any talk as to why they came after you but not a DLP?
If I was a sinister person, I would say it's because we had former Senator David Leinhelm elected, and one of the reasons that has been said is because he was number one on the ballot and to the left of the Liberal Party. So there is a theory that when the Liberal Democrats draw to the left of the Liberal Party on the ballot, we perform better. And that theory seems to be true. So that's why they came after us, because they were sick of people getting confused with them and us.
Yeah, I remember that being an issue. I proposed an issue back in the day. Yeah.
I guess that's another reason. That's another reason why having the mandatory voting is so bad, because people, they just see Liberal, they vote for Liberal. So I guess what the government's trying to do there is, stop people taking advantage of that and voting for minor parties with the same name. But it's ridiculous to see that they're doing it right now as well, when they're at the most threat. Because you're seeing One Nation, Family First, the UAP, Lib Dems all siphoning off votes. We've got the One Nation securing their first seat in the South Australian Legislative Council this election. I think we're looking right now at potentially seeing the Lib Dems get a seat as well, though it's pretty close with Labor. Do you think that they feel threatened because they're bleeding votes so much?
I think that they realise that they're not the Liberal Party of the Menzies era. I mean, if the Liberal Party were who the Menzies era Liberals were meant to be, I would probably be a member if the Liberal Democrats didn't exist, because if there was only two choices between the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, which is what the direction we seem to be going in, that's who I would have voted for. So it's definitely a threat. And it's definitely because people are finally waking up to the fact that the Liberal Party, they're not economic managers that they said they were. Look at the budget that came out this week. Big spending, cutting a few taxes only temporarily, throwing money around like it's confetti. They're not economic managers at all anymore. They used to be economically conservative. They're not. The Liberal Democrats are. We have a 10-point freedom manifesto that has great economic policies in there. 20% flat tax rate if you earn above $40,000, more money in your pocket. Permanent cut to the fuel excise tax, not a pissy little half percent of it. We want to get rid of these taxes that are hurting people now. The Liberal Party it's just a budget for an election. So they're not economic conservatives anymore, and they were never socially progressive. So that's why I'm a Liberal Democrat.
Yeah, the election budget was never a good idea. We knew they were going to call the election after they put the budget forward. Was it like $1 billion in discretionary spending? You got the 250 to welfare, to people on welfare, 420, which is a really good number, really based number for the tax rebate. Just all this spending, spend, and they're going to. And of course, you've got rampant inflation as it is already, or especially in America. But we're going to hit the same way as they are with the inflation, the way the government's going right now. So I guess that's a good transition, actually, into talking about Western Australia, because was it last year you had the state election and the Lib Dems lost their seat? So how do you think that's going to play out? Do you think that we're going to see the Lib Dems be able to win under you in Western Australia?
So I had the pleasure of working for former the Honourable Aaron Stonehouse, who was our upper house representative for the Liberal Democrats prior to March 2021. And it was just so refreshing to have a voice for freedom in the upper house. And now you can see that we have nobody. We have nobody who's standing up to McGowan at all. The Labor Party, they're too scared to, because they know that he'll punish them and he won't give them a ministry, or he won't pre-select them at the next election if they dare speak up. The Liberal Party barely exists and they don't have any balls anyway. And the National Party, well, I don't really know anything about them. You barely hear them. Now they've started saying things about the border, but the border's been closed for 2 years. Have you been asleep? The state of Western Australian politics is quite dire. It is very grim. And if anything, it's actually made me more passionate and more of a libertarian, because taking away my freedoms, taking away my right to see my family across the border in South Australia, let alone my family overseas in Italy and Ireland, making me choose between a job and 3 injections, because the 3rd jab is mandated here. If I left the state and I wasn't injected, I couldn't come back, even though I live and work here and I'm running for office here. They wouldn't let me back in. The state of Western Australian politics is quite dire. So we need to send someone to Canberra to hold him to account. Morrison was missing in action the whole pandemic. I actually forgot we had a federal government, because what did he do? He actually came out in support of the hard border, along with Albanese. So who did we have standing up for us in Canberra? Nobody. So we need to send a different voice, someone who's not afraid to say what the people are thinking, because remember, I'll be there to represent the people of Western Australia, not my own political interests or self-interest, which a lot of them are. That's why we need to have a Liberal Democrat in the Senate. And I've got David Limerick in Victoria running for the Senate, Campbell Newman in Queensland, John Ruddock in New South Wales, who's been on your show, and another fantastic candidate announced this week, Topher Field. Topher Field is running for the Senate in Tasmania. That's amazing. The Battleground Melbourne documentary that he did gives me goosebumps thinking about it. And Canal Tonkin in South Australia. We have a fantastic lineup of Senate candidates across the country, but it is an uphill battle. It is a David and Goliath battle because we aren't as funded as the big parties. We've had to spend our time and energy in the High Court just to keep our name, and we have to change it going forward. It's really hard for minor parties to be part of the democratic process in Australia, and it's only going to get harder. So we need people like me and my Senate candidates in the other states to be able to stand up to these people in Canberra.
Yeah, I had a Merkin on Instagram, messaged me on Wednesday, and he said that Tim Dillon is coming to Western Australia, to the American comedian, to do a comedy show, and then he's going to Sydney and Melbourne. And I went, hang on, he's unvaxxed. So you've got unvaxxed international travellers coming to Western Australia, but triple vaxxed Australians can't get into Western Australia. Go figure. And yet somehow he's getting more votes. Was it almost a 20% swing in the upper house? I think there's 6 parties in the upper house in Western Australia. Compared that to 6 parties in the lower house in Queensland. And lower houses are always harder for minor parties to get into. So you think comparing that and seeing how much control he has is ridiculous.
So my friend in South Australia, James Hull, who of course is still in the mix for the last Legislative Council seat, he offered to come over to help me with my campaign. He's fresh off the campaign trail. He wants to help. I have friends and family in South Australia who want to help. If they're not vaccinated, they cannot enter Western Australia unless they go via Bali and then come back in as an international arrival and do 7 days quarantine out of their own money in a hotel to get into a state in a country where they live in. I can't even believe I'm saying that. And we're in April 2022. We're not in March 2020, 2019 anymore. 2020, I've lost track of the time. And we have no one standing up to McGowan. That is the point. And that's why we need to send someone to Canberra who will stand up to him, because we don't have an election for another 3 years here. We do have one of the policies that I love, and I know Centrist, you love it too, is our recall election policy. How amazing would it be if we had the opportunity to turf McGowan out and say, hang on a second, these things that you promised us, we're still operating under a state of emergency, but we have the AFL happening now. We've got games at Optus Stadium. So how can it be a state of emergency when we're living in a society that is trying to get back to normal, but you've got mask mandates everywhere. You've got businesses enforcing his mandates. We don't have a choice here in Western Australia. If you're a small business owner or a business owner, you have to enforce the vaccine mandates. In other states, it's been a choice. It's here in Victoria where David Limbrick lives, which is the harshest on the businesses. So even if they didn't agree with them, they face massive fines, $50,000 fine if you're found to have one unvaxxed person in your venue. And we're not talking about 2 injections, we're talking about 3. So if you're due for a booster on Friday night and you go out and you haven't had it, you can't go in the pub, even though you're a day overdue. This is the world that we're living in Western Australia. I don't know if your listeners believe me, but it's true.
Oh, it's horrible. Like in Queensland, so if you're unvaxxed, you can go and get takeaway, but you can't dine in at a fast food restaurant. If you're vaxxed, you can dine in. Yeah, it's fine to stand in line and then wait for your food and then leave. So apparently it's like a 20 minutes wait till COVID hits you. It's ridiculous how they time these things and how they work that out.
I think the one that woke up a lot of the West Australians, especially the people who would consider themselves Liberal voters, were the ones when they put the bottle shop ban on for the unvaccinated, and you could go into Aldi and buy food from Aldi, but you couldn't buy the alcohol in the same store in the same line. So a lot of this stuff has been a very power-hungry type, I don't want to say dictatorship, although it's leaning towards some form of tyranny. And I think, and this is why I'm such a big advocate for the recall election, I think if you have that ability to say, hey, you've overstepped the line. We want to get a petition going and have another election. I think you would rein in a lot of this sort of stuff, hopefully, because like I said, a lot of people in the West have turned on McGowan when he backflipped on the borders, and which I knew was going to happen, but it was good to see people finally going, hang on, what the hell is going on? So, but for the people who've been waiting since the start for it to catch up, it's just, yeah.
The other thing about this is not just about whether or not you're vaccinated, it's an issue of medical privacy. Why should I have to show my private medical information to the barista who's making my coffee? So if I sit outside and he gives it to me for takeaway, like in Queensland, that's fine. But if I wanted to sit in and read the paper, although I'm not sure why I would read the West unless I was trying to start my day with a bad note, I can't sit in a coffee shop unless I show a stranger my private medical information. And that's another part of the problem that people have. It's not, some people it's a vax issue, some people it's a medical privacy issue, some people it's a why should my vaccine status be linked to my job or my travel. These are good questions. And another policy of the Lib Dems is a royal commission into the handling of the pandemic. So we get all of these premiers, all of these bureaucrats who've been making these decisions unchecked in front of a royal commission to say, why did you ban unvaccinated from the bottle shop? When at the start of the pandemic, we were allowed to go to the bottle shop, but we had limits on how much we could buy, like it was prohibition again. So that's part of a policy that if you have Liberal Democrats in the Senate and in the lower house, hopefully we're running 90 candidates across the country. This is the biggest election we've been a part of because it's the most important election in my generation's history and for future generations. So it's going to be a very interesting federal election and very important one for Western Australia if they want someone to stand up to McGowan.
So one of my largest concerns, with the whole, it was never necessarily the vaccine. It was more the passport. When I was very, very anti the passport, and I know where that's sort of heading. If you go on the federal government website, they have a digital ID system set up ready to be put in place, which includes a state-controlled bank system. Is this something that you guys will be looking into, obviously, to try and hopefully block or explain it a bit clearer to what the end game is for something like that?
So another one of our policies is freedom from surveillance. So in Western Australia, we have this Safe WA app. Well, we're saying scrap the app. Why do you need to know where we go on a Friday night? Why do you need to know that Lady Liberty went to 10 bars in Northbridge on a Friday night? And my health is my responsibility. So the contact tracing has gone out the window. Remember that federal government app that was meant to help? Waste of taxpayers' money. There you go. We don't need the government watching and tracking our every move. We're adults. We can manage our own health and our own lives. There's no need for the government to be spending our money on apps and technology just to track and trace us. The surveillance state is growing, and we're absolutely against that. We're all for privacy for individuals to do what they like as long as they're not hurting anybody else.
And it doesn't help that they actually lied to us about the use of the app as well. So for those who don't know, it was the information was supposed to stay as a contact and trace thing to help the government control spread of the virus. It was ended up used to track down, and whether or not it should have been caught, because the person I think they said was guilty of some crimes, but the problem is that they chose to violate the promise of the data secrecy, and then I believe the police also said that they would do it again. So for me and a few others, it was like that was the moment we got rid of the app. It was just like not doing that. So.
Do you remember when the police used to have to get a warrant to do this kind of thing? Where did that system go? I never downloaded the app. I will never download the app. I carry my papers in my pocket, and when people ask to see them, I say, papers, please, here you go. My grandfather, who fled Italy and fled fascism, would be turning in his grave to hear the kind of society that Australia has become, which is another reason that I'm running, because I'm genuinely concerned about the future Australia that we are going to be leaving our kids and our kids' kids, not to mention the debt. That's just the tip of the iceberg. It's the freedom side of things that I'm concerned about. And I know this is getting to be a little bit of a saturated market with the minor parties, but the Liberal Democrats have always stood for freedom since we were founded in 2001. We haven't just come to the party now that it's been taken away from us. We had Senator David Leyonhjelm in the Senate making speeches about just how important freedom is. The Anzacs, April 25, Anzac Day is coming up. Be interesting in Perth because apparently only 500 invited attendees can go to Kings Park, which is a state-funded war memorial, to pay tribute and to commemorate a day which is so important to Australians. I've already said that I'm going whether I'm invited or not. I've got a lower house candidate running in Haslock, Stephen McKenna. He's got medals from his generations of family that's fought in these wars. So, yeah, the surveillance state and the freedoms that have been taken away from us are two big issues that I'm passionate about, and I want to fight to keep them.
I want to get back to the recall elections policy that the Lib Dems have. I think it's very interesting to propose that in Australia, where it's very different to, say, the US system, for example. So I'll just give a brief rundown of how it works in the US, and then if you want to chime in and say how it would work in an Australian context. So for the US and for our American audience, because I think we've got a few Americans up already who are up not only to watch the podcast. I can see you guys in the chat. I've got a few questions for you actually from the chat. I'll ask you at the end. For them, because their governors are elected by popular vote, they can then recall them. Whereas for us, it's the premiers are basically elected by one seat in the lower house, and then chosen by their party. And even then, the party has the main control on who is pre-selected to run for that seat. Whereas in the US, I know often the voters get a say in the party members get a say in who runs for that party for a certain seat. Whereas the premiers are pre-selected by the party for the party and elected by the party. So how would you propose doing a recall elections in Australia? With that in mind.
So hello to our American guests. I love America. I've had the pleasure of visiting there 2 times, and I'm planning to go back this year, hopefully, if I physically and logistically can. So recall elections is an important issue. As mentioned, I think we've outlined pretty well why we need them so desperately in Western Australia right now, because we've got 3 more years of living under this tyranny. So for recall elections, we have a petition set by a set percentage of any given electorate should trigger a by-election. So if you're from America, a by-election is when the sitting politician is recalled, and then we go to another vote to say who's going to replace this person. So the trigger could be something like, hang on, you promised to open the border in February. You've reneged on that. The people want the border open, but what power do we have? We have nothing. We can march in the streets. I've been going to every freedom rally here in Perth, but we've been painted as the far right. So they're not listening. They just insult us. They forget that they're there to serve the people. So having the ability to have a petition, a set percentage in the electorate to recall a certain politician who's broken a direct promise and is on the record as promising something and doing the complete opposite when we voted for them because they said they were going to do something in the first place. That's massive. And that's actually, well, it is massive, but it's not. It's democracy. You're there to serve the people. And if you're not going to serve us and do what you said when we voted you in, we should have the power to take that back. And I think you'll find a lot of politicians will actually have to stand by what they say and do what they promise. We don't have that at the moment. They say anything to get our vote. The budget, they'll spend anything of our money, other people's money, to get our vote. So we need more power to hold them to account. The citizens, the people, should be the third house of parliament.
Now, when you say the electorate, do you mean their individual seat?
Yes.
Or do you mean okay, yeah, gotcha. So how would you do that? Would it be the same for the upper houses then? You would do the entire state or the entire region, or South Australia, the entire state again has a say in recalling a senator? or how would that work in the same way?
I've only looked into it from a House of Representative issue because they're the ones, they're the people's house. So the Senate is the check and balance. So it's so the Senate in Australia is different to the Senate in the USA. But the House of Representatives are there to serve the people. It's called the People's House because of that. So it's directly targeting those who have gone against something they've promised the electorate.
Yeah, again with you now. So with the Premier, would that be just their one seat, one division that votes to recall them, or would it be an entire statewide thing? Because on one hand, you can make the argument that because they lead the entire state, everyone should have a say in recalling them. But on the other hand, they're only elected by one electorate, so why should that electorate have a say in electing them, but not in recalling them? So how would the Lib Dems approach the idea of recalling the Premier or even the Prime Minister?
Well, I think you'll find in WA specifically, he's basically ruling the state with an iron fist. Labor Party members are too scared to speak out for fear of retribution. So it only makes sense in a state where the majority is held by one party and he, as the leader, is the one making these decisions. Or in fact, in the other hand, it would give the person the ability to say, hang on a second, my electorate wants this and has voted for me because of this. You're coming in and ruling over what I've promised. So the recall election shouldn't target me, it should target you. So that's another thing to consider with these recall elections. I mean, it's pretty clear that politicians don't feel any accountability except for the 33 days election period prior to the federal election. We need to be able to have the ability to call them back.
And again, it goes back to the point of, the budget's all around elections and getting votes. So, it's crazy the things they'll promise to get elected. I remember Julia Gillard, that's probably the first time I was interested in politics at all, was when she promised no carbon tax. And then, of course, we know how that turned out for her. Yeah, I don't like the idea of making a budget based just around elections. So, looking at the Lib Dems policy, are there any other manifesto points that you want to go to? I want to talk a bit actually about, and I know Centrist had the same idea in mind in talking about anything to do with drugs and with the approach to cannabis in particular. Because I know the other ones, the hard drugs, are more controversial, but especially in regard to cannabis and how the Lib Dems would approach something like that.
Yeah, so the Liberal Democrats have a pretty honest and clear policy on drug reform. All adults should be able to make the choice to take any drugs as long as it's not hurting anybody else, and any drug that's not as dangerous as a drug currently available on the market. So it's pretty basic. You'll see in Western Australia, 2 legalised cannabis party people got elected at the state election. There is an appetite for a cannabis industry, and it's not actually that controversial. You see in America and Canada, there are a lot of states that have legalized it as a recreational, medicinal, manufactured use, cultivation and harvest as well. McGowan came out and said, I'll never consider legalizing cannabis for recreational use. And it's very hard to get access to it for medicinal purposes in Australia. It's very expensive, which creates a black market. And that's the other thing. The criminalisation of drugs and the war on drugs hasn't worked. Putting people in jail for possession of a tiny bit of weed, I mean, is that really the society that we're living in 2022? The health benefits of things like marijuana and even MDMA now, there's studies that show that it's good for treating PTSD. So why are we looking at these kind of drugs that have proven benefits for adults in certain circumstances? And if a doctor is recommending it, this isn't just people on the street. This is research. This is universities. These are doctors who are saying and showing the proven benefits of using medicinal marijuana, cannabis, MDMA for treatment of conditions. Well, why do they have the right to say we're not even going to consider that? I mean, they've relied on public health advice for the pandemic. So what about health advice that's been proven as well? And you can see legalized cannabis had 2 people elected. South Australia have recorded the biggest ever votes for the legalised cannabis party in South Australia at the recent state election. There's an appetite for it. So now's the time for us to really move on this. We're so far behind in Australia compared to our friends in America and Canada. It's really a disgrace.
Yeah, I think seeing two members of that party being elected, legalized cannabis to the WA upper house, really was like the silver lining of that election for me. And I've got to say, that's still my favorite party name in Australian history. Hemp Party, help eliminate marijuana prohibition. Still my favorite party name that's ever come up with in Australia. I think it's the best way to get your message out there is the Hemp Party name. Although unfortunately, I think they've changed from that to legalize cannabis.
What about the Pirate Party or the Sex Party?
Yeah, but then again, the Sex Party, the Reason Party, it's no secret I'm not a big fan of Fiona Patton. Not the biggest fan of the imagination.
Yeah. I don't blame you.
It's really interesting that Mark, I hadn't actually heard him say those comments because if I'm not wrong, we actually have a farm down south for marijuana, and we've also got and they're also branching out now, which is because, like you've mentioned, MDMA for psilocybin mushrooms have also something that's really taken over in America with the mental health benefits, and they are apparently starting to grow. I think the local ones down south. So it's interesting because it's almost like then are they just trying to have a monopoly on the system, or are they just worried about a free market, do you think, or is it just doesn't think it'll win in votes?
Well, I hate to say this because I'm a libertarian and I believe that taxation is theft, but if you create a legal market, you'll be able to get some revenue from it. So I'm not an anarchist, so I do believe in some level of taxation. I have flirted with the idea of being an anarchist, but I need a little bit of regulation for people, if that's not too controversial to say on your program. But yeah, the mushrooms as well. Why? This is another thing that I wanted to talk about, mental health. So we've just suffered 2 years of a pandemic. In Western Australia, we're still stuck in March 2020. I'm genuinely concerned about the mental health of people going forward in this country. Governments love to throw money at problems, but don't actually look at the results and if it helps people. Throwing money at a problem isn't going to fix that. We've seen that time and time again. So we need to look at holistic approaches to problems like mental health. So drugs should be a part of that conversation, and that shouldn't be a controversial thing to say. We already have a medical cannabis industry for treatment of chronic back pain and that kind of thing. We do need to take on board the advice from the doctors about introducing prescriptions for things like mushrooms and MDMA, if that's what the science says. We've spent 2 years hearing, trust the science, listen to the science. Well, why don't you listen to the science on drug reform? That's a message that I'm happy to take to the Senate if I'm elected. And former Senator David Leyonhjelm tried to give the rights for the NT and ACT to have possession of marijuana and grow plants. So unfortunately, Commonwealth law trumps territory law. So yeah, you need a voice in the Senate as well to talk about these kinds of things.
I think it should be. Okay, sorry. For some reason, I keep getting this loop.
Love it.
I think we should be careful not to, well, personally anyway, not to put it on a purely prescription-based thing. I think that something like, especially weed and mushrooms and anything that grows naturally, I don't think should really have the banned limit to it, and it should definitely be decriminalised at the very least. There's no reason why anyone should be getting jail time for plant use. But that's yeah, like I said, got to get someone in the Senate in order to try and champion that. But I wanted to get that out primarily for people who may be listening who are concerned about the conservative side of the Liberal Democrats, because I think people misinterpret that about the Liberal Democrats. So there is actually, in terms of liberty, it comes with future freedoms around some of the left-wing policies that people kind of on the left champion and don't realise that that's in there.
Yeah, so I speak to a lot of Greens voters who say they vote for the Greens purely because of their cannabis policy and because they're not convinced that voting for a party that's smaller than the Greens will be enough. And I say to them, the difference between us and the Greens is we don't want to tax you through the roof to be able to buy a product that should be legal. It's about the taxation side of it. So I think Liberal Democrats, back when I ran for Linehelm, we had a policy on how the taxation system would work. So it was nothing compared to what the Greens want to do. And you're right, recreational drugs and the use of these kind of things should be up to the individual. As long as you're not hurting anybody else, you should be able to do to your own body what you're comfortable with. It's pretty simple.
Okay.
We're willing to work with the Greens to legalise marijuana. Is that a policy you guys are interested in doing? Because I'm a big fan of unity. I get a lot of flack from this people because I'm an anarchist. But would Lib Dems work with the Greens, even if it meant taxing marijuana use? Is there a line there in the stand that you draw, you personally or the party as a whole?
Personally, I would always work with anyone who had a similar goal in mind. I'm a very goal-orientated person. But the thing that would stop me from agreeing completely with them would be the taxation side of it. And it's as simple as that. And I don't want restrictions on businesses either. So, or restrictions on how many plants you can grow if we do create that industry. So I want it to be regulated, but not regulated to the point where the black market is cheaper than the legal market. And that's something that when I speak to Greens voters, they don't quite understand, because at the moment, the black market, you can buy weed quite easily and cheaply. So there's a few people out there who say, I don't want it legalized, because if we legalize it, then I'll have to declare it, I'll have to pay taxes, I'll be audited. But you're right. So the legal system has to make sure that it's cheaper than the black market. So you can make sure it's not getting in the hands of kids, which is another thing. I'm only talking about adult use, not under 18. So there needs to be some regulations to bring this black market to light and have it regulated, but not to the extent that it's more expensive than if it was a black market.
Yeah, that's the catch. It's always one of the things you're going to try and balance out, because if you could get it, I think you'd find that with, say, MDMA, you could probably get it and do it cheap enough, because then you could argue that the quality control is something that is like a benefit as well. But with things like marijuana and stuff, it'd have to be pretty loose on the regulations in order to make it affordable and viable. So.
And vaping as well. I mean, this is one that's
ridiculous.
Australia 2022. Vaping is so hard. That's prescription-based. Last I heard, Greg Hunt was so against vaping because he thought it was a gateway drug for youth to take up smoking. I don't know where he got that from. Again, the science shows that it's safer than cigarettes. But for some reason, it's really hard to get in Australia, and you need a prescription to get it through a chemist for vaping in 2022 in Australia. This is what happens when you don't have libertarian voices in the Senate or in the Parliament.
Cigarette tax is another one. If anyone's been a smoker or smoked in the past and then had to deal with the price hikes on cigarettes, it's really something else in Australia. So.
And alcohol tax. So one of the things that I've been campaigning on is cutting the tax on craft breweries, because at the moment the tax is worked out by the alcohol content. So you're actually punished if you create a beer that like the double blacks from when I was in my youth. The higher the alcohol content, the higher the tax is. So something I've been saying is this is punishing small businesses who are passionate about something and have created a product that there's a market for. So why are you taxing them like this? Same with the wine tax in Margaret River and Swan Valley. But in the budget this week, it came out that they didn't want to cut it because it would be sexist, because men drink more beer than women. That was actually their explanation to craft brewers for why they didn't touch the tax. I'm a woman. I drink beer, and a lot of my female friends drink beers. I actually couldn't believe that was a legitimate reason why they said they couldn't cut the tax on craft breweries.
There's actually a massive influence of women brewers especially in the Perth scene. There's some really amazing women out there doing some stuff. The other one that you missed is that not only, if I'm correct with the craft breweries, it's not only do they get done with the alcohol percentage, don't they also get done with packaging? So you get different tax rates for packaging as well. So it's not just that you get taxed for the alcohol, what you make, then how you decide to sell it in what container you sell it in is then taxed a certain way. It's like, yeah, I don't know. That's one of the things that I'm glad you said that, because there's a lot of people in that industry. If we can get that out to them, because it's been a massive booming industry for a few years now. It probably deserves a bit of a break. I know. I spoke a bit with John Storwood from Nail Brewing, and he was telling us about all that sort of stuff. So it's they definitely do make it hard for the small guys.
And the other thing is these are small businesses. So I remember when the Labor Party used to be all about the small businesses and Liberal Party entrepreneurs. Well, why are you punishing these people who are quitting jobs that maybe they went to university or higher education for, and they've gone out on a limb to create a product because they've found this amazing recipe, and then you're taxed through the roof to the point that you're thinking, why am I doing this? Another fun fact from Perth and WA, the colonial beer. Do you remember that cancel culture? Because of all of the things about colonialism, it wasn't cool anymore, so we couldn't call it that. Cancel culture is another thing. Free speech is one of our policies that I'm passionate about. You should be able to say what you like as long as you're not inciting hatred. It's pretty simple. But that's controversial to these people, these woke people who need to be wrapped up in cotton wool. And you can't say that. You can't use that word. Well, why? Am I actually being offensive, or are you choosing to be offensive because of this cancel culture that we've created for the next generation? I love the fact that you can say whatever you like in Australia to some extent. Hate speech, obviously, that kind of thing, especially on the internet, needs to have some sort of punishment if you are saying things that are insightful or hate speech. But anything else should be on the table. I thought this was Australia.
I'm a big fan of hashtag repeal 18C. It's ridiculous, you know.
Yes, that's one of our policies too. Yes.
It started off as good intentions, but it's to the point it's gotten to right now is just ridiculous. I wanted to go back to the taxes on alcohol for a second. I was trying to find this while you two were talking. I was trying to find some notes from an old podcast I did on taxation, and I don't know where the sources are from this, but we have the fourth highest beer tax in the world, 42%. And the third highest on whiskey and gin, 57%. And then the 12.5% excise tax on cigarettes. So the rate of taxation on alcohol over 50% for whiskey and gin is just crazy.
And you'll find these kind of taxes hit the lower socioeconomic groups the most, because they're the ones who, like, for whatever reason, they like to indulge in these kind of things, and that pick your poison, that's fine, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. So it's actually punishing those lower economic societies. I mean, look at our friends in New Zealand, though, banning cigarettes for those who aren't 16 yet. So anyone under the age of 16, cigarettes are an illegal product. To try and stamp it out. Well done. You've just created a black market.
Yeah,
I know that the Liberal Party in Australia loves to hammer on about how Aboriginals are, they're lazy bums, they don't do much, and then they go and they say, they spend all the money on cigarettes and alcohol, and then they go and tax it.
Yeah.
You're like, well, you're taxing the things that you say they use the most to get money from them, from welfare. So you give the money in welfare, and then you take that money back away from them. The best way right now to help if they are that lazy, if they are just bums that sit there and drink all day, the best way to help them will be to stop those taxes. It's counterintuitive to say to tax basically the alcohol that they say they're addicted to.
Obviously, you need support, but I think probably the worst tax that we saw come out was the RTD, the ready to drink tax. It was mind-boggling to me, because what that did, like I saw it when I was working in bottle shops and stuff. Like you saw people who would normally go and buy a 6-pack then just go and buy a bottle. And then so then they were drinking way more than they should have been. Like, you know what I mean? Like they usually just pace themselves, but in the lower, like I said, when it was the pivot point in the lower socioeconomic areas, people would buy bottles of bourbon instead of like the 6-packs. So
yeah,
and now you
so
look at
for
the prices,
those,
it's like
for those watching, the RTD is the tax on those pre-mixed drinks like vodka cruises in Australia.
we just
so
look
yeah,
at
that
any of the bourbon and cokes now. They're all like a 4-pack's like $25 to $30. Like that's a lot of money for 4 drinks, and most of it's in taxes.
Yeah, sin taxes need to be abolished or at least watered down dramatically. That's one of our policies as well.
That's good.
Stop legislating morality. It's you know,
That's
if the idea is if the idea. And as a Christian, I keep going after Christians who do this, the Bible bash to say, you know, we need to outlaw prostitution, adultery, all these things because they're moral sins. If you want people to be good, you know, don't force them to be good. You know, love isn't love unless it's freely given. So if you want people to, you know, not do those things, then you know, get rid of it and then convince them. It's like get rid of the ban and then convince them why it's bad instead of just using the law to stop them.
Yeah, it's not for the role of government to be trying to control people's lives to the level that they are in Australia, trying to price us out of the market for things that we just want to enjoy and put in our own bodies. The government overreach in Australia has just gone way too far, nanny state stuff, and this is not the society that I want to leave for the next generation, that's for sure. So I'm adding my voice to the table, trying to get a seat in Parliament to say these kinds of things, because nobody's talking about this at the moment, not since Senator Linehelm was there.
We haven't even had the election date set yet, and already you've got Liberal and Labor sending out social media ads saying, you know, the other side's so bad on taxation. The Liberal Party sent out, it was yesterday, I saw a sponsored ad from them on Instagram. Labor sees success as something to tax, not encourage. Both sides are doing the exact same thing. They're in a race to the top for taxation right now. And that
race to the bottom.
Yes, a race to the bottom for everyone else except for them. And that brings me back to the Freedom Manifesto. One of the policies that you guys have is low flat taxes, 20% for company tax, 40% for above 40,000. Sorry, 20% for above $40,000, which is a tax-free threshold compared to $18,200 right now. How did you guys reality test that percentages and set that as being, this is why it's like, what was the reasoning behind setting these figures as being good figures to use?
So we're very lucky that the founder of our party and our current president, Dr. John Humphreys, has a doctorate in economics. So this policy document hasn't been written by policy wonks who went to uni for 3 or 4 years and consider themselves an expert. This document, one of the key authors, has a doctorate in economics. So that's how it was formulated based on his amazing knowledge. And wouldn't it be great to have more money in your pocket? 20% flat tax rate for everybody. So that actually gives people more motivation to earn more money, because at the moment, the more you earn, the more you're taxed. So why would somebody, and it gets to the point where you're like, oh, do I actually want a pay rise? Because then I'll go into this bracket, and so therefore it would be better for me to stay in this bracket. That's the actual thinking we have to have in Australia because of the taxation system. Income tax, it just shouldn't be a thing. GST, I know Western Australians are always screaming, give us our share of GST. Well, let's take a step back and say, why should we be paying GST in the first place? You're taking tax everywhere. Everywhere we look, we're taxed. Can you just give us a little bit more of our own money that we earn? I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. So I'm really glad that we have this policy. We've campaigned on it before. It's not a new idea that we thought of just because there's an election around the corner. We've long advocated for a 20% flat tax rate above 40,000, but no one else would talk about that. All these tax cuts are temporary and only minor, and Labor's budget will cost us more taxes. So,
and my second point, getting on from that, would you keep it as fiat currency, or would you go gold standard or crypto or something else?
I'd love to have crypto.
That's a big thing for libertarians right now.
Yes.
Is if you have fiat, you keep having inflation and devaluation of the currency. So would you try and set it to, whether it be the petrodollar, which is dying right now because of the Ukraine thing, apparently, although it's a lot more than just Ukraine, gold, like, would you try and fix it to something else, or would you keep it as fiat currency?
That's a very good question. And as soon as I get off this podcast, I'm going to ring the economist himself and ask him. But I'm glad you mentioned crypto because that's another currency that I think should be allowed. And I know that people are tearing their hair out because they want to regulate it, and it's not regulated. But it's an example of the free market, that people want this kind of thing, so we'll go and create it. And I'm all about the free market.
Although now America's going to bring in, their government is going to bring in its own cryptocurrency to apparently, well, they're looking at it, so it's like...
Our government's doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Like, it's on there.
If it's really that bad of a thing, why are governments trying to adopt it? You know, remember when El Salvador adopted it last year and they got so much flack from Twitter liberals, lowercase L liberals, not conservative liberals. I hate that naming system. Anyway, they got so much flack from, you know, legalizing crypto as legally accepted tender, and then it's like, well, you got the Australian government's considering it, the US is considering it. You know, if it's really that bad of a thing, why are these governments going to consider bringing it in any way, shape, or form?
They're not considering Bitcoin to be
their own crypto,
creating their own, which is if you listen to guys like Majid Nawaz, who was talking about I'm going to screw up the acronym, but it's a digital currency thing that's the governments are trying to put in place for each country. It's quite it's an interesting rabbit hole to go down. So.
I've looked into that enough. Yeah, I'm more on the gold side of the debate than the crypto side of the debate, so I haven't really read it that much. If you're going to go find out that, I'm going to go find out what we were talking about Centrist. I'm going to go research up on this because I haven't followed the crypto debate much. I'm more in the side of gold.
So basically, in short, it's the way he explains it is it's a digital currency, but it is a controllable. So therefore, it can be tracked and controlled, and then what you can spend it on is then can be decided by the government or / employers. So that's sort of the government's digital.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's tracking and tracing.
I remember when the government tried to ban how much cash we could physically carry around, and then they were talking about getting rid of cash entirely. I think it might be my Italian background, but I love having cash. I've been taught to always have some cash on me. So when I was hearing that the government wanted to say how much cash I could carry around, not only was that against my upbringing, but why should the government tell me how much cash I can physically hold? Some of the things that we have to experience in Australia is quite sad.
Well, again, going back to to what they're doing to people on welfare, which is mostly to go back to the whole welfare thing. You know, they've done that for welfare recipients. They said, you know, you can't buy because they're still giving them cash. It's all card based now. And they're saying you can't buy these things. So you can only spend a certain amount of especially Northern Territory, which is where it's really being rolled out because it's federal. Yeah. More federal control there. They're limiting what you can buy, and I guess that's the next step for the what people call the global reset.
That was one of my first back.
Sorry, Centrist. Yeah. We have so many stories to tell. One of the first things that happened when I was working for former Senator Leyonhjelm is they wanted to put controls on what welfare recipients could spend their money on, like what you're talking about now. And Leyonhjelm made the point that firstly, we need to look at the welfare system as it is, because there's a lot of middle-class welfare out there. There's a lot more to come with the childcare subsidy program that both of the major parties are talking about at the moment. And he said, I don't believe in a lot of the welfare exists, but I don't think the government has the right to give out money and say you can't spend it on this, this and this. So I think that was a really clear and good argument to make back when I was working for him. So I believe the same thing too.
I'm in your camp now as well. It's actually one of the things that I've backflipped on. I always thought cashless welfare made sense to me. I was someone who worked. I was like, why should someone who's getting money from the government be able to spend it on whatever they want? But it wasn't until I started looking into what that could mean and what it does mean for people. It means that you take away their agency. So if you take away their ability to manage money, they are permanently stuck on a system where the government tells them what they can and can't do. And that's not fair on anyone who's trying to get off or get out of it. Because if you've had to be on welfare, it's not always by choice. Most of the time it's not. So, it's a system that I've had to reverse my opinions on and become more libertarian based on understandings like that. So.
And one thing important to point out about libertarians is we do believe in a safety net. So we're not talking about getting rid of all welfare. We do like the fact that communities could look after the individual, so they have someone to go to in their immediate area instead of turning to Canberra. But we don't want to get rid of welfare entirely, because there has to be a safety net. Some things are out of our control. We're humans, it's life. That there needs to be something, and there is a role for government to play in this space, but it's gone too far the other way, to the point where middle class welfare. One of the things Lionhelm did when I was working for him, they were talking about childcare subsidies. They just wanted it open-ended. So if a couple was earning over $500,000, they could have middle-class welfare to pay for their kids' childcare. Why would a couple who earned over $500,000 be entitled to other people's money to pay for their lifestyle choice to have kids? So he brought in a cap on, I think it was about $350,000, which is still quite generous, but it was open-ended. And now they're talking about rolling that back and saying anyone who's had kids, regardless how much you earn, Labor will pay 90% of your childcare costs. And then people are wondering, why is the price of childcare going up? Because these companies know that the government will be paying for 90% of it. So I'll just keep increasing my prices. I'll certificate the industry. So people that would, in my day, be known as babysitters, suddenly be called teachers, even though you can't really teach a 2-year-old, and that should be the parent's role. And then they're screaming about childcare costs.
I will interject with that one. They do, if I understand correctly, it was a law that was brought in, I think, that they had to have a qualified teacher come in. So it wasn't just someone who was just now called a teacher. It's actually someone who's got to have the right qualifications to go into the centre, which, again, is another government pushing something on someone, whether or not a system should have it or is one thing. But
so there should be a choice. If parents want to send their kids to a facility that has a childcare centre that has people with these kinds of qualifications because they want their kids to be taught at that age, go for it. But there should also be a market to cater for those who aren't bothered. They want to read to their kids every night. They want to teach them themselves, and then pay the cheaper amount. That's what the free market is there for. But there's no choice in Australia because the government has regulated the entire industry.
I think even people like myself, and I don't believe in any welfare state at all. Even like people say we don't care about, the poor or the marginalised. We still want them to be cared for. We still want to look after them, but unfortunately, we get painted as being, anti-people. Unfortunately, because like even if whether you want a small welfare state or no welfare state, if it's not maximum welfare state, it's fascism or anarchy or communism or insert adjective here.
Yeah, people have gotten so addicted to government money, not realising it's actually your money in the first place. So they feel, thank you for giving me $420 in my tax return, but how much tax did you actually pay to get $420 back?
Yeah, people don't seem to understand the fact it's your money in the first place. What does the government have to take it from you and then give it back? I had a bit of a rant as someone said on Twitter, arguing about let's go back to the budget, having a budget in surplus versus having it in deficit. Well, both are bad. If you think about it, the deficit's obviously quite bad, but being in surplus means the government's taxing more than they should be. Again, that's going to, that's arguing that there should be any taxation at all. But even from a libertarian, non-anarchist standpoint, they're taxing too much, so they should be lowering that. You want it to have imbalance, not in surplus or in deficit.
Yeah. One thing I found during the JobKeeper thing, some of my friends didn't understand that they would have to eventually pay it back one day. I'm waiting for the day the government bring out a COVID tax to pay for all this stuff that they did during the pandemic. JobKeeper, what a disaster with all that money going to Harvey Norman instead of into the pockets of people. Yeah.
And then the whole RAT thing as well.
Yeah.
That just, when you see people do stuff like that, like Scott Morrison, with his buddies, and then it paints all of us in a bad picture as well because we're seen as being, like him. I wanted to ask you how the Lib Dems been going, getting, if you received much backlash from the left during the election campaign, South Australia and now federal, if you're getting much backlash for being far right or hard right. Because I think, was it the Australian or is it either the Australian or Sydney Morning Herald painted you guys as being hard right, or they said that Campbell Newman was hard right. So has there been much of a backlash against the Lib Dems for that, and how have you guys been responding to it?
See, that's the thing about libertarian is people don't understand it. So I call myself socially progressive and economically conservative. So socially I'd be left, but economically I'd be right. And then people don't actually know where to put us. So it actually depends on the issue that you're talking about. So I can see why we sometimes get called right-wing because of their economic policies. But Centrist is right. We don't talk enough about our social policies, which would actually see us sitting more on the left side of politics. I haven't experienced too much name calling yet, but I'm sure I'll get called an extremist at some point. I'm just waiting for it. I'm waiting for the election to be called and all the attention turned on me. But I think it's pretty clear, socially progressive, economically conservative, and you're allowed to be like that. You don't have to be right or left. You can be principled and not sit in one camp or the other. You can sit in both.
It should be a balance anyway.
Yes.
It should never be all one way, because if it's all one way, then it's going to swing back the other way and it's going to come unraveled.
I agree.
Which is it's a pity, because I think a lot of people don't read past those headlines and see this stuff, which, as I said to you before the show and through the show, that this is why I'd like to see the Lib Dems push their social stuff a little bit more, just so that you offer that other alternative to for the left-wing voters, who I like to consider myself. I was more left beforehand, so that you've got, so you know that you can go and vote someone that will share your social ideas as well as your understanding that the economy can't just keep spending money and think that everything's going to be okay. So
yeah, we've got a big job to do in terms of education in relation to our party and what we stand for. It's hard when we don't have a lot of friends in the mainstream media who are happy to paint us as right-wing or extremist or whatever the name they want to call us that week. But former Senator David Leyonhjelm brought in a bill to legalise gay marriage. So how can you say that we're not socially progressive when he actually brought that in years before it was legalised? We're all about individuals making their own choices as long as they're not hurting anybody else. And that's a message that seems to resonate with people the most, because when people say, oh, you're running for politics, their eyes glaze over and they're so disaffected by the state of politics, especially in Australia, that I just bring them back to the conversation and say, well, wouldn't you like to be able to do what you want and not hurt anybody else and not have government looking over your shoulder or tracing you on your phone or taking money out of your pocket to pay for some infrastructure project that gets blown out over budget? And then people say, oh yes, politics affects nearly every aspect of our daily life. And that's why it's important for people to have a voice, and the people to have a voice that they want to send to Canberra to represent them. That's another reason that I'm running, because I want to have someone to vote for. Nobody else I would vote for, because they don't have these Freedom Manifesto policies. They're tied to party politics. They're not given their own voice. And that's one thing I love about Liberal Democrats is we're all different people, like Campbell Newman, me and him, not very similar. David Limbrick and I, we have a lot in common with our freedom stuff, but we're from all different walks of life. Obviously, I don't look like a politician. I don't really speak like a politician. I'm only running for office because I want to give a voice to our generation.
You said you haven't been called hard right yet. I'm sorry, but the two qualifications of being libertarian are having a podcast and being called fascists. So you haven't done those, you can't be libertarian.
She has been by default. If you've been to the protests like I have, then you're a Nazi, so technically.
True.
I'm actually speaking at the protest tomorrow for the first time here in Perth. The Freedom Rally, if you're in town, midday Supreme Court Gardens, I'll be able to get up, give a little speech.
I wanted to get back to something that you haven't really mentioned much in the manifesto, and that is defense spending. Because I noticed on Twitter today you sent out a tweet about because we changed our mind on that French nuclear sub deal, it's going to cost us $5 billion to go from France to the US, just because we wanted to suck US's cock more than the France's cock, because we decided to, the military is still complex, and how it works, we decided it's better to be friends with America than with France. It's $5 billion. So there goes more of our money. We're spending billions on tanks. So what's the Lib Dems' approach to defense spending, especially right now with Ukrainian news? But putting that aside, what's the approach in general to defense spending?
Yeah, so you'll notice that we want cuts to, firstly, duplicate government departments. So why is there a Department of Education at the federal level when it's a state-run system? I'm all about decentralisation, by the way. I want the people in the community to make the decisions, not people in Canberra all the time. So we've proposed cuts to every government department except defence, because we recognise the times that we're living in. It's a very different world to before March 2020. We're being realistic about this. We're an island nation. We do need to have some money spent on our defences. So we haven't proposed to touch defence yet, but that doesn't mean we won't look at it when we have the opportunity to be in Parliament talking about these kinds of things, because we're against wasteful government spending. We're against big projects that get blown out and the taxpayer ends up footing the bill for them. So it will be looked at in the event that we have the opportunity to. But at the moment, in the world that we're living in, we're not proposing any cuts to defence. So that's a good pick up by you, Stuart. Thank you for asking.
Someone commented, rip up the ANZUS Treaty, and I want to get to the questions at the end, but I want to talk this one right now. What is whether it be the party or you in particular, what are your thoughts on foreign ties? Because I know the Libertarian Party in America, for example, wants to get out of all those foreign alliance messes. So what is your thoughts or the Lib Dems' thoughts on foreign alliances like ANZUS and the other ones?
Yeah, so I definitely recognise the need to have relationships with nations around the world and similar nations. I've been to Canada, New Zealand, and the UK, so I can see our history is similar as well. But I'm also a pacifist, so I'm also against going into other countries and trying to fix their problems. I was against the war in Iraq, if I was around at the time, I would have been against the Vietnam War. My dad commented that he could see me at a protest in the 70s, so I was maybe born in the wrong era. And I said, no, Dad, I'm marching in protest in 2022 in Perth. So that definitely anti-foreign intervention, but definitely for speaking to other nations and being smart with our diplomacy. The way they handled the French submarine deal was atrocious. It was just amateur. And now who pays for it? The taxpayer does. Really, it's some of the things this government does. We could be here all night talking about how a sad state of affairs this is.
Yeah, as I said, they spent billions on tanks. It's double digits in the billions of dollars on tanks during the food shortage. Like earlier this year, January, we had that food shortage. They went and spent money on tanks. People couldn't get food. And the Australian government says, we're going to buy some new shiny tanks. We haven't used tanks in our foreign war since Vietnam. And they wanted to get new tanks in. They wanted to update from slightly older tanks to more modern tanks. There's not much difference between the two, though. And they spent, at the same time as people literally couldn't get food because there was a shortage, because of the because of the COVID policies of the states. And again, federal government can intervene. Whether or not they should is a different debate, but they can. But Scott Morrison, as you said at the start, nowhere to be seen during COVID.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going back to those submarines, I know that one thing that you were really keen to talk about is energy and their nuclear power. So what are your thoughts on that? I know that nuclear is a big divisive topic in Australia, especially right now. The progressive Labor faction was very anti-nuclear. And so as a result, we haven't had nuclear ever. What are your thoughts on nuclear and uranium for energy?
Well, it's pretty simple. If you can't say that you're pro renewables and pro net zero and pro anti-climate change, and then at the same time say, but we shouldn't have nuclear power. Well, sorry, I can't really take you seriously because this is close to zero emissions. We have some of the biggest uranium resources in the world in Australia. South Australia, Olympic Dam, my birth state, second biggest reserve of uranium in the world. And what do? We dig it up and export it. We don't use it for ourselves. We have an energy supply crisis in Australia. I was living in South Australia when we had this statewide blackout. The statewide blackout, the whole state, and there was pictures of it from space, was completely black because we had no energy security or reliability. One of our policies in the Freedom Manifesto is nuclear. In Western Australia, for example, there's a moratorium. You can explore for it, but you can't mine it. So why would a company spend millions of dollars exploring this vast state for a resource that if they found a big deposit, they couldn't do anything with anyway because the state government has banned them? One of the policies in this document is remove all moratoriums or bans on any state uranium mining issues and give companies who want to go out and spend millions of money and create jobs and create a whole industry, because we're not just talking about jobs on the ground, we're talking about universities having a bachelor in uranium mining or whatever it will be called. So the flow-on effects of having this industry created in Australia will solve some of the job issues and will solve our energy issues and will actually contribute to the net zero fantasy that they're going for because it's so close to zero emissions.
Yeah, 100%. And it's also one of those things that some of the pro renewable guys always talk about needing a backup energy source anyway. So it's either you do that or you rely on natural gas, which I know a lot of West Australians in particular are not very fond of fracking. But also, if it's not that, then you've got to go back to coal. So it makes sense to use a product that doesn't create emissions, and especially not just emissions, but also particle pollution. If we can keep all that stuff down, I don't understand. It's just, I suppose it's just that natural fear of it. But yeah, I don't know how you can educate people on how the systems have changed. And
well, we don't have the fault line. Yeah, we're not going to build it on a fault line, which was the problem with the Japanese reactors. And I'm not just saying it should be nuclear or nothing. It should be part of the energy mix. There is definitely a market and consumers can drive that. If a consumer only wants to power their house on renewable energy, there's a company, it might charge you a lot more in your bill, but you can go to sleep at night knowing you're not contributing to climate change, even though you might get in your diesel truck the next morning to drive to work, but that's another issue. At least you're trying. If there's a market for people who just want nuclear power, well, let's provide it to them. It needs to be part of the energy mix. Unfortunately, with renewables, you do need that base load power from somewhere, which is why we're relying on coal at the moment. But that's why nuclear just is the sensible option and the sensible alternative, because it's less emissions and it's not the coal industry that people seem to have turned off, which is fine. The market should drive change, but give the market the chance to respond. If you've banned something or taken away the incentive for companies to provide the market with that, then we're not going to get anywhere, and we can't provide the market with what they're screaming for. What
about geothermals as an option as well?
Yes, yeah. So, and hydrogen is another energy source that the government is exploring, although I must say that I don't believe in government spending money on experimental technologies. It should be private enterprise paying for this kind of thing. But there's definitely an exciting space in the future for energy in Australia if we had a mature enough government who would talk about it and not respond to things like there's a nuclear power station on fire in Ukraine. Oh, we better not legalize it here. I mean, that's the kind of world that we're living in, where it's driven by what's on Twitter instead of rational conversation.
It wasn't on fire either.
It wasn't on fire.
If it saves one life, that's all that matters, right?
Yeah.
As long as someone's not dying.
Yeah.
It can be ineffective. It can be a horrible system that we have right now with the power. But as long as no one's dying from it, we're fine. And I think it's interesting that we're not having that discussion right now, because people say, well, we've got all this space, like, let's use it. The discussion then as well, a lot of it is desert in the middle of Australia. What is he going to put out there? You can put out there nuclear reactors that are away from civilization. The problem you then run into is Indigenous land, which is a whole other debate. But putting that aside, I think it's a discussion to have is relying more on nuclear, hydro, of course, we're surrounded by seas, solar. But unfortunately, it all seems to go wind power and wind and solar. There's no diversity at all, and I think that's the important part. There is having diversity, having a free market where you can choose which works best, and of course they can then compete, and everything improves through that.
And we should have those things. We should have those things. It's the environment and the climate here in Australia is well suited to renewables. So it's not. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be diversifying in that realm. I think there's a place for all the sorts of technology. If we want to move away from coal, though, and be serious about it, we need to look into things like nuclear. That's if you're serious. If you're not serious and you just want it to be a money grab, like the subsidies and stuff that come from the government, and it's actually Glenn in the chat, I'll just bring that up now. He asked if you know what the subsidies are for renewables, and then also obviously the subsidies for coal and what sort of impact they have.
So Lib Dems don't want to subsidise any energy at all. It should be market driven. So the government shouldn't be propping up one form of energy over the other. Get out of the way and let the market decide. One interesting point about renewables, wind farms and solar is the material used to make these kinds of things takes so long to break down. Like when someone told me about solar panels in particular, I couldn't believe it. Now we're all talking about we need to recycle, we need to reuse, we've got to look after the planet. Then we go out and build massive farms of this stuff that will take generations to break down. And then I bring up, well, what about nuclear power? Oh, we can't have that. Well, that's what I mean about a mature debate. People need to put their fear aside. We've been living in fear for 2 years, especially in WA. It's been driven by fear, the rhetoric. Let's go back to the science. You've been telling us, listen to the science. Why can't we listen to the science on things like nuclear power?
Spot on.
It's funny how they say to us, we can't have nuclear because it could harm the environment, which is a very, very low percentage of chance of happening. But when it comes to COVID, there's a very low chance you have to get the vaccine. I've got those figures for you on nuclear subsidies renewable and coal subsidies. For renewables, 2.6 billion. For coal, 11.6 billion, because we know that spermology is coal.
There should be zero. It should be zero. That's
sending coal to Ukraine. And it hasn't even left ports yet. It's still here. We send it to them, but it's still sitting in Australian ports. So, What are the Lib Dems' thoughts on net zero then? If you're talking about renewables, pushing for renewable energy, do you have net zero? Is it net half? Is there any government policy, or would it be entirely, up to the market to run based on that? Is there, because we do know that even if somebody who doesn't believe that climate change is a thing, you can still have to accept that it can't hurt to use renewable energies. It's not necessarily a bad thing to be to be trying to be more pro-environment and environmentally friendly. So is there a stance that you have on should we have any government control there at all?
Well, I would actually love to see the detail on the net zero target. So does that mean that me as an individual will have to start counting how many flights I take, how much carbon has been emitted because I drove to work 200 days of the year? How is it actually going to be achieved? Like, it's fine to come and make motherhood statements like we're going to achieve net zero by 2050. But can you please tell us how we're going to get that? Who is going to be responsible for ensuring we meet this arbitrary target? It should be market driven. If there is an appetite for lower carbon emissions and the people want to have the ability to use less carbon driven materials like cars, then let us drive the change. Why does the government have to set an arbitrary target that we all have to scramble to work out how we're going to make? It should be driven by the people. We have a policy of no net zero with the caveat that I put on it, unless the market wants to drive to meet that target. It shouldn't be up to the governments to set it and not even tell us how we're going to make it. Does that mean there's going to be prices put on things like cars on top of what they already cost, on top of the petrol prices, on top of how much a plane ticket is? I would actually really love to see the government's plan to get to net zero before I can comment on it. But I would just go back to the point that it should be driven by the market. If that's what people believe, and I know my generation in particular is screaming about this because they're worried about what the planet is going to look like when we pass on and for the next generation, that's fine. I understand your concerns, but can we have a proper plan of how we're going to deal with it? That's where nuclear power comes in. Zero emissions. Why won't you have that on the table to discuss instead of just motherhood statements making people feel bad for having the air conditioner on all night? So net zero should be market driven. It shouldn't be arbitrarily set by the government.
They're going to replace carb counting with carbon counting, it looks like.
I'm going to steal that one.
Sorry, you go.
That's what's supposed to be tied to that digital currency as well, is like a carbon footprint donate to it. So as I said, if you look at those wires, he breaks it down.
Yeah, I think I actually have heard them say that at one point. Now that you say it, I think I remember them saying it at some point. But it's like, if the government can't even run the census website on census nights, how can they run this?
Yeah, I don't know.
That's what I mean. When you try and ask about the detail, you're left confused. Like, I'm genuinely confused about how we will get there. And when people ask him, there's no detail.
Especially considering we banned like other versions and development into it. The other thing people don't consider as well is that although it is a good idea to do that, to drop in it's not, Australia hitting that target is not going to change much if other people don't, which we don't have the right to tell a developing nation that they can't use coal in order to be, considering that's how we got to where we are. It's quite a moral battle to be able to go, should you kneecap a developing country and its development in order to minimise the planet? And if you believe that's so, then you've got a lot of people you've got to go and explain that to. So.
Yes, I completely agree. That's another point that I do bring up is who are we as a first world country to take away the power from a developing nation? I don't know about you, but I very much care about the individual on the ground. Do you want to care about the climate to that extent where you think we should just take the rug out from under them? Well, what are you going to give them in their place? And nobody has an answer to that. There definitely needs to be a proper discussion looking at this holistically and not just first world nations sitting in a room patting us on the back because we've come up with some really good figure and then no way to implement it, but then punish third world countries who have such a huge population that rely on coal and rely on Australian exports. That's a really good point, and thanks for bringing it up, Centrist, because that's the kind of thing that libertarians think about, is how it's going to affect the individual on the ground.
don't know if you follow him. I'll just bring you up since we're on that topic. Michael Schellenberger has written a couple of books, and one of it was about the energy source. He used to be very progressive, he used to be pro-nuclear, but he was talking about the recycling, like you said, with the solar panels. But what they were doing is, instead of recycling, they were sending them to the third world countries with a couple of years left on the panels, and then leaving it to the other countries in order to go with the waste. So there's a lot more to this renewables and I think we sit blinded by the goal as opposed to the process and the plan, which is like exactly what you're trying to say with the market, I think. So.
Another thing that occurs with windmills and wind turbines, for example, is land use and property rights issues. I know my grandfather, as I said at the start, spent a lot of weekends on the farm, and she was approached to have wind farms on her property, and so was her neighbour. And her neighbour was so against the idea that they kicked up and went to council. But my grandma was like, okay, well, I'm happy to have that because I want to be part of leaving the planet for my grandkids and my great-grandkids. And as the property owner, I should have the right to be able to go into a deal with the energy company who wants to build these on my land. But then you had the council get involved because the neighbour didn't want them because they were unsightly, and I don't want to get up in the morning and have to look at these things. So then it's a whole property rights issue as well. So if you want to have renewables in this country, where are you going to put them? I'm very excited to hear that there's going to be an offshore wind facility in Victoria in Commonwealth borders. So that's fantastic, a lot of wind energy there. But it's a property right issue too. Who gets to decide where these things go and how much power can the local council or state government have and these kinds of things. Interesting debate.
Especially when we talk about like air pollution, for example, it's going to be very, very complex when you start talking about, is this a nuisance or a trespass under the law? It's going to be a very, very complex issue to discuss when you talk about things like that. And even you get like flocks of birds go through wind turbines, just get killed. And I think they forget about that as well. You're going to need to try and find a large area, and you've also got to worry then about deforestation at the same time. But and look how bad it has been for bird migration. They don't account for bird migration when they set up these wind farms. And then of course you see dead corpses everywhere from the birds they used to kill. And I think it's not discussed enough either. They think about the positives, but there are also drawbacks that aren't discussed.
Yes, good point.
I might go through some of these questions we have from the chat now because we've got a few for you. This is the latest one we have, but it's most relevant for right now. Would you cancel our Davos seat?
Would I what? Sorry.
Would you cancel our Davos seat? So that's the seat. That's our WEF seat.
I don't think I understand.
They're asking what forum would you withdraw us from that?
Oh yes. I think that's a no-brainer.
I don't know who would keep us in there. Well, the Liberals and Labor would, but
I would pull out of a lot of things. I don't even believe in having another layer of government, which is the United Nations. It's just government on government on government. Like no, no.
We already have 3 levels. We didn't have a 4th one. That does make it worse.
Right. Yeah.
And more elections as well. More elections.
Only if they're recall elections.
I wouldn't mind that. Recall the UN would be great. I would support that. The next question we have: businesses in Western Australia. Actually, I'll pull it up on screen, but I still read it out for the audio version. Question for Kate: businesses in Western Australia have been criticised for the mask mandates, but have yet to hear them speak out against vax passports. When do you think this will be addressed by them?
Well, yes, as I said earlier in the show, businesses in Western Australia are hamstrung by the McGowan government's mandates, so they are not allowed to let patrons in if they're not wearing a mask or if they don't show their private medical information. So in other states, it was left to the business to decide, which is what I believe. A business should be able to choose who they let in because that that's their business. If they don't want to let someone in with tattoos, for example, then that's their right. But to have a government put these rules on businesses, but not only that, and make the business enforce their rules. So these poor businesses are already suffering from 2 years of border closures. They were already suffering from having to close because of the lockdowns, have to enforce these state government restrictions. I hope it will be addressed soon. I know McGowan is looking at the restrictions at the moment and cherry picking which ones he thinks, which freedoms he should give his serfs back, obviously forgetting who he serves. So I'm hoping that the vax passport and the mask mandate will be reviewed soon, but where's the federal government been on this? Missing in action. There's no one talking for Western Australia in Canberra saying, hang on a second, why is the state government putting these restrictions on businesses? It's time for government to get out of the way and let businesses and people and families come back to life and live normally.
Yeah. The next question we have is, where did Lib Dems go wrong during the 2021 state election? I presume that means Western Australian state election. Was there anything we could have done, or was McGowan's popularity impossible to penetrate at the time? He said he volunteered on the day.
Oh, well, thank you for volunteering.
On the ground.
Yeah. Yes. Volunteering, we really need all the help we can get because, like I said, we are a minor party and we're going up against these parties with bigger pockets than ours. Where did it go wrong? So I was actually a candidate in the 2021 state election too. I ran in the seat of North Metro, which is one of the upper house regions that has since been abolished in electoral reform. I think people genuinely believed that McGowan had protected them and had saved them. He had the luck of a sky-high iron ore price. He had the luck of already being one of the most isolated states and Perth, the most isolated capital cities in the world. And people genuinely thought he was protecting us and trying to achieve this COVID zero fantasy that was never a reality. So yes, I can see why they would vote for him because we got to keep our lifestyle for a lot longer than the other states. But at what cost? The mental health cost. Stopping people from seeing their families just across the border or overseas. The long-term effects of these decisions we haven't seen yet. I'm genuinely concerned about that, which is why we would call for a royal commission into these kinds of things. But I think people just genuinely felt that he'd kept them safe.
People were scared as well.
Yes.
People forget there was there was a rise in cases in Melbourne at the time. A lot of the people that I know that voted, I tried to tell people not to. I think I made my joke because I'm like one of the 5 people who didn't vote for Mark McGowan.
Me too.
Yeah. He also had the luck of the fact that we didn't have COVID in here also didn't expose his horrendous record on the hospitals, which was actually one of the main reasons he was voted in the first place. So I think, like, I was the person who voted for Mark the first time around because it was to replace the Liberals because they had been ruining the hospitals, and all Mark's managed to do was make them worse. So it's I think it was more. I wouldn't say it was necessarily that he was popular. I would have just said it was more that, like what you said, he kept them safe and people were scared. So,
yeah.
And you don't usually change in the middle of a catastrophe. So it's...
That's right as well, yes.
Yeah.
And then the final question I have, also about another Lib Dems member from South Australia, who was of Italy, who's involved with us and he was involved in James's campaign on the ground. So something I never understand is people being so attached to the left label. Who cares whether people call you right wing? Have you seen what the left is today? And I want to build on that and ask you your thoughts on pigeonholing.
Well, I think you'll find that, and that's what we've seen in Australian politics, is the further a party moves to the right, the further the party moves to the opposite. But for some reason in Australia, we're seeing the parties move the same way to the point that we don't know who's left and who's right anymore. I don't why would you pigeonhole someone? I don't understand either. Like I said, I consider myself socially progressive, which would be left, and economically progressive, which would be right. As long as you have a view and you respect other people's views, that should be it. That should be the end of the discussion.
I think also the attachment to the left for people like myself, is obviously where that label was intended, is because that's where you feel like you are now homeless. So this is a thing where you for a long time believed that's where you sat, and now you're finding out that there's a whole other place where you got to try and find where you can find this balance between where you think some things are right wing and some things are left wing. And so obviously you don't want to lose part of what you are, and obviously, and there's also then the criticism and the media hack job of right-wing people being really terrible people, which isn't true. But there's always those things, but I think it's more just this is where you came from. If you come from what you thought was a Greens voter or a Labor voter, and then and then also because then you can bring more people who identify as left over, if that makes sense. So I think it's important. I don't like the two labels, but I think it's important in order for the context so that you can engage with people who are already in that mindset. So I think that's why. People worry about being called right wing when they're not fully right wing.
Yes. Yeah, I take your point. But it all comes down to principles. As long as I can go to sleep at the end of the day knowing if I was elected, I never voted for a reduction in liberty or an increase in taxes, then it doesn't matter what the people call me right or left wing or radical or whatever. As long as I can go to bed knowing I didn't abandon my principles like a lot of these politicians do, then that's all that matters to me rather than a label.
Yeah. Awesome.
And I had two questions from myself. The first one is, what do you think about the federal election? We've seen Labor win every single election we've had. ACT, Northern Territory, I think, Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland. The only state that didn't win was Tasmania, but that stayed 13 out of 25 in the lower house. It stayed the same. What do you think will happen with that at the federal election? Do you think we'll see Labor as a majority government, or do you think the Liberals can hold on?
Like I said, I have nightmares about waking up in an Australia where I have a Labor Party state, total Labor Party controlling upper and lower house, and a Labor Party federally controlling the upper and the lower house, with Greens as their coalition partner. That would be my worst nightmare. So I'm hoping the great people of Western Australia understand the need for different voices to stand up for them. I know I'm not going to get 60, 70% of the vote, but 20% of people, I feel like at least 20%, some of the things I say will resonate with them, especially those people who migrated here like I did, whether it's domestically or internationally, who was standing up for them and their inability to see their families because of the closed border. Nobody was. You need to have a different voice at the table. It's going to be hard because of the changes to the electoral system like we talked about earlier. But I genuinely hope we see a crossbench of Liberal Democrats from around the country. And at this stage, if I was a betting person, which I only bet on my team Carlton, so it's good to see my bet finally giving me some reward after 15 years into a 5-year rebuild, but we won't talk about the footy. Scott Morrison in Western Australia, I think he's going to lose a lot of seats, Western Australian seats. So it might be a Labor government. I would probably bet on that.
I think it's a one-seat majority for him right now, something like that. Sorry, you want to say something, Centrist?
No, that's all right. Yeah, it's all good. I was just going to chime in and go, generally we have voted the opposite of what our state government is like in the past. So there is a chance. And I'm hoping that a lot of people have, because I know a lot of people have sort of gone off Labor with the way Mark's acted, especially in the last few months. But it's just whether or not we can get enough, people can get enough of the minority parties to get enough acknowledgement and awareness amongst the apathetic voter is probably the one we're going to try and catch them.
Yeah, well, the Liberal Democrats are running in, at this stage, 9 of the 15 House of Representatives seats. So if you jump on the website, ldp.org.au, and head to the Western Australian section, you'll see that we have at least 9 candidates running for us at this election. So there will be the ability to vote for us in the lower house as well as in the Senate. So I'm running in the Senate with my running mate, Dr. Peter McLaughlin. Yes, we have a doctor who's running on the ticket. He's very qualified to talk about COVID and everything, being a doctor. He was an anaesthetist, so very experienced and committed libertarian. So you'll have the chance to vote Lib Dems in most lower houses in Western Australia for the first time. This is the biggest election we've ever been involved in for our party. 90 candidates across the country at this stage. You have 10 days after the writs are issued to nominate. So Centrist, if you want to run for the Lib Dems in Western Australia, give me a call. I think you'd be great, not to pressure you or anything, but you're the kind of voice that we need at the table. What do you think, Stuart? Centrist for
I've said it before, and this is and I still hates political parties, and I've said it before that you should consider, at least consider running. Now, I don't vote for individual parties. I vote for the candidates, not the party. But even now, I've said that he should consider running at the very least.
We'll have a drink over it and see what happens.
My second question was mandatory voting. I forgot to ask before, but that I didn't see anything about voting on the manifesto. What's the Lib Dem stance on mandatory voting?
No mandatory voting. It should be a choice.
Good.
Because we want informed voters as well. See, that's the other issue. People hate the fact that they turn up to vote. And so they just stagger in there hungover on a Saturday and put something in a box and then off they go for another 3 or 4 years. Informed choices is what shapes a society, and not enough people are politically engaged. This election, I hope we'll see a bit more because of what's happened and people finally waking up to the fact that Australia is over-governed and over-regulated. But definitely no mandatory voting, should be an individual choice.
It keeps in mind, I was talking to a Greens voter last night who's very pro-choice, who supports mandatory vaccine, who supports mandatory voting, even though they're supposedly pro-choice. And that came to mind then was to ask you, make sure that Lib Dems actually have a good stance on voting, which is good to see.
On that then, I'll push on that. What would your safety protocols be in terms of, I don't want to get too into it because obviously we're on YouTube, but obviously there was concerns in the American elections for ever since ever. But one of the things that I've said in the past about the advantage of having mandatory voting is that you've got a set number of votes that can, therefore it doesn't fluctuate from election to election. So what sort of safeguards would you put in place, do you think, in order to be able to control and
the turnout, the voter turnout? Yeah, I see what you're saying. Well, it's an education campaign as well. That means parties will have to work harder to get you to turn out in the first place. So people will actually have to stop and think about where their vote goes instead of turning up on the day and voting for the party with the prettiest candidate or the prettiest colours. So I think it would actually be a good thing for democracy because people would be forced to some extent to think about it. And that means parties like ours will have to work twice as hard to get the vote. And I know that sounds even like hard even just thinking about it, but that's how it should be. It shouldn't just be expected and taken for granted. We should have to fight to get people to vote for us, not force them to vote for us because for some reason we want grown adults to be part of a conversation even if they don't want to be a part of it, which is why you see donkey votes, the rise in donkey votes in South Australia this election because people just are so fed up with government. And if only they knew James Hull, less government, more freedom was right there in front of their fingertips, but he's still in the race. So fingers crossed that he gets over the line.
I'm always glad to see that minor parties oppose mandatory voting because it works out good for minor parties to an extent in that you guys can get donkey votes. Of course, people preference Labor and Liberal, but you guys can get donkey votes, which is good for you guys. So it's always good to see that minor parties are willing to support voluntary voting. Because we've had mandatory voting for well over a century now, at least in Queensland, 1915 from memory. It's still here, and it should have gone 100 years ago.
That's right. That's right.
And my final question for you, if you could repeal any tax, what would it be and why?
Oh, can I just say sin taxes, and then I can get a raft of taxes? I think I can say sin taxes. I'm cheating.
I'll let it slide this time.
As possible.
I'll let it slide this time.
Sin taxes, because your lifestyle choice shouldn't be punished in the hip pocket just to fund some green government project sin taxes.
Right, before we finish up, is there anything you want to plug? I'll link the manifesto in the description on the audio and YouTube versions. Is there anything else you want to plug before we finish up?
Just if you're in Western Australia, I would really appreciate your support. It is an uphill battle. It's a David and Goliath battle, but it's the most important election of our generation, my generation, your generation. So if you would like to get involved, please follow me on Twitter, send me a message, go to the ldp.org.au website and click volunteer. Donate if you've got some spare change lying around. Anything you do will help us fight the major parties in this most important election that I can remember. So thank you for any support you can give. If you just want to retweet me and share things on Facebook so you can educate your friends, that's appreciated too. It's about having the conversation, and anything you can do to get the libertarian message out, and that there is a sensible alternative that represents the left and the right, then please, anything you can do to help will be greatly appreciated.
Thank you. And thanks for coming on a Friday night as well. I'll let you get back to your drinking.
Thank you. I'm drinking from my Senate mug from when I worked for Linehelm. Hopefully I'll be able to get my own after the election when I'm in the Senate. So thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I paid for this.
Sure. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.